November 1876, and Ingrid Sorensen stood in her doorway, watching the sky turn the color of old iron over the Bitterroot Valley. The thermometer read 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and it wasn't even Thanksgiving yet. She'd been in Montana Territory for 8 months, long enough to know her nearest neighbor was 4 miles east, and the settlement of Stevensville was a full day's ride south. Long enough to understand that when winter came to this valley, it didn't take prisoners. What Thomas Mackenzie didn't know as he rode past that afternoon was that beneath Ingrid's feet, accessible through a trapdoor under her kitchen table, sat 340 cubic feet of bone-dry firewood. He wouldn't learn this for 6 weeks. By then, his own woodpile would be frozen solid, and 3 families in the valley would be burning green wood that produced more smoke than heat. The whole thing started in April, 3 weeks after Ingrid's husband Lars broke his leg when his plow horse spooked. She'd set the bone herself using techniques her grandmother taught her in Bergen, but Lars wouldn't be working until late summer. That left Ingrid with 160 acres of homestead claim, a cabin that leaked in 4 places, and the certainty that Montana winters could drop to 40 below zero. She had 12-year-old Eric, 8-year-old Astrid, and the responsibility of keeping them alive. Lars had managed to split about 2 cords of wood before the accident, stacking it in the traditional way against the north wall of the cabin where the roof overhang provided some protection. Ingrid knew it wasn't enough. She'd heard stories from the trading post about the winter of 71, 72, when families burned their furniture, then their floorboards, then seriously considered their wagon wheels. But splitting firewood with a broken-legged husband and 2 young children presented certain complications. That's when she noticed something about the cabin Lars had built the previous fall. He'd constructed it the Norwegian way, with the floor elevated 18 inches off the ground on field stone pillars to prevent rot and provide air circulation. The space underneath was just dirt and darkness, occasionally visited by chickens seeking shelter from hawks. Ingrid had crawled under there once to retrieve a laying hen and noticed the ground stayed remarkably dry even after spring rains, protected by the overhanging eaves and the natural slope of the land. She mentioned her idea to Thomas Mackenzie when he stopped by to check on Lars. Thomas had homesteaded in the Bitterroot since 1868 and had survived 8 Montana winters. He'd built his own cabin, broke his own land, and buried his first wife after pneumonia took her in the winter of 73. His opinion carried weight in the valley. "You want to dig out under your cabin?" Thomas sat on his horse looking down at her with the expression of a man who'd heard every foolish notion the frontier had to offer. "Ingrid, that's your foundation you're talking about. You start excavating under there, you risk undermining the whole structure. One good frost heave and your walls could crack. Besides, even if you could dig it out, that space would flood first heavy rain we get." "The ground slopes away from the cabin," Ingrid said. "Water runs off natural. Until it doesn't." Thomas shifted in his saddle. "Look, I know you're in a tight spot with Lars laid up. I can spare a couple cords of wood, and I'm sure the Hendersons would help out too. No need to tear up your foundation on some notion." But Ingrid had learned something about charity during her first winter in America, which she'd spent in a Minnesota boarding house while Lars worked lumber camps to earn their homestead stake. Charity came with strings, sometimes visible, sometimes not. It came with expectations and obligations, and it could be withdrawn the moment you offended the wrong person or failed to demonstrate sufficient gratitude. Charity was a debt that couldn't be calculated or repaid on any honest ledger. Self-sufficiency, on the other hand, was a currency that never devalued. She started digging the 3rd week of May after the ground thawed. The plan was simple. Excavate a chamber 6 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 5 feet deep directly beneath the main room. She'd shore up the fieldstone pillars as she went, leave a 3-foot margin around each one, and create access through a trapdoor in the cabin floor. The excavated dirt would build up the drainage swale downslope. Eric helped when he wasn't working the garden, and Lars offered advice from his chair. She worked in 2-hour shifts, crawling into darkness with a coal oil lantern and short-handled spade, filling bucket after bucket with Montana soil. The second person to hear about her project was Willem de Groot, who ran a sawmill 15 miles north. He'd come to discuss timber with Lars and found Ingrid emerging from under the cabin, dirt-streaked and exhausted. Willem was Dutch by birth, American by 20 years of hard living, and possessed practical knowledge from building half the structures between Missoula and the Idaho border. You're creating a root cellar under your living space? Willem studied the pillars. How are you supporting the floor joists? Leaving the pillars untouched, working around them. 3-foot clearance minimum. And moisture? Wood stored underground will rot before Christmas. Not if air circulates. I'm putting in 2 ventilation shafts. Natural convection pulls air through, keeps it dry. Willem squatted and peered into the darkness. Where'd you learn about air circulation? My father was a ship's carpenter in Bergen. Built cargo holds that stayed dry in the North Atlantic. Same principles apply. Maybe. Willem stood up. But a ship's hold is sealed tight. You're talking about bare dirt walls. Get condensation, you get rot. Get fungi in your firewood storage. Might as well burn wet logs from the river. He wasn't wrong. Greenwood contained 50 to 60% moisture by weight. Seasoned firewood needed below 20% to burn efficiently. Store it in dampness, and it would reabsorb moisture, undoing months of drying. But she'd thought about this problem during the long winter evenings in Minnesota, watching condensation run down the boarding house windows. Air circulation was the key. Moving air carried moisture away. Stagnant air let it accumulate. The ventilation shafts would create a pressure differential, pulling fresh air in from the upslope side and exhausting moisture-laden air from the downslope side. As long as the chamber stayed slightly warmer than the outside air, which it would from ground temperature alone, the system would function. She explained this to Willem, who listened with the expression of a man who'd seen too many frontier innovations fail to be easily convinced. I've seen what happens when people get creative with their shelter, he said finally. Fellow up near Frenchtown decided to build his cabin half underground for warmth. Seemed smart until the spring melt. Water came up through the floor like he'd built on top of a spring. Had to abandon the whole structure. He paused. But I suppose if anyone's going to make something like this work, it'd be a Norwegian. You people have a gift for staying dry in wet country. It wasn't quite an endorsement, but it wasn't a prohibition either. Willem rode off with a promise to check back in the fall, probably expecting to find the whole experiment abandoned or the cabin collapsing into a sinkhole. By mid-June, Ingrid had excavated roughly half the chamber. The work was brutal, cramped space forcing her to work hunched over, lantern shadows jumping and twisting, air close and thick. She hauled out 47 buckets of dirt some days, each requiring a trip up a makeshift ladder to the drainage pile. Lars worried about cave-ins, inspecting exposed pillars every morning for signs of stress. Ingrid had reinforced each with additional field stones, creating wider bases that distributed weight evenly. The soil composition changed as she dug, loose topsoil giving way to dense clay, hard as brick and just as stable. That clay held its shape without shoring and sealed against moisture better than any timber she could have afforded. The third skeptic arrived in July. Margaret Chen had come to Montana via California, where her father worked the gold fields before dying of mercury poisoning in 1865. She'd married railroad worker Patrick O'Brien in '72, and together they'd claimed 160 acres on the valley's western edge. Margaret knew about hard work and risk, having lost her father to an occupational hazard that seemed manageable until it killed him. "I'm not questioning your ability," Margaret said at Ingrid's kitchen table. "I'm questioning the wisdom of weakening your shelter for dry firewood. You could build an external shed for a fraction of the effort." "An external shed needs lumber I don't have money to buy," Ingrid said. "It needs a foundation to keep it off the ground. It needs a roof that won't leak. And even then, any structure above ground is exposed to wind, weather, and temperature swings. Underground stays a constant 50 degrees year-round. No wind. No rain getting through the cracks. No sun heating it up and causing condensation cycles." Margaret had helped Patrick build their cabin, so she understood construction. She also understood economics. "What about the trapdoor? You're talking about cutting a hole in your floor. That's a cold spot, right where you're trying to stay warm in winter. The trapdoor will be triple layered with a sealed edge, better insulated than most cabin doors." Ingrid had worked out the design in her head. 2 layers of pine boards with a layer of wool batting between them, the whole thing edged with leather stripping to create an airtight seal. "And I'm putting it under the kitchen table where we can throw a rug over it." Still seems like a lot of work for firewood storage. It's not just about storage. Ingrid hadn't articulated this to anyone else yet, but Margaret's directness seemed to invite honesty. It's about proving I can maintain this homestead even when Lars can't do the heavy labor. It's about having something that's mine, built by my own hands. And it's about not depending on the charity of neighbors who might change their minds come February. Margaret understood that last part. She'd lived in a gold camp where charity was a commodity traded like everything else. "I suppose that makes sense," she said. "Just promise me you'll be careful. I've seen enough widows in my time." "I'm not planning on becoming one," Ingrid said. By August, the excavation was complete. The chamber measured exactly 72 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 2 feet at the deepest point. Ingrid had sloped the floor slightly downhill to encourage any water intrusion to drain naturally toward the downslope vent shaft. The walls were surprisingly smooth, the clay having been shaped by the bucket edges into gentle curves that required no additional finishing. The pillars stood like ancient columns in an underground temple, each one now seated on a base of carefully stacked field stones that distributed their load across a 3-foot circle. The ventilation system was simpler than Willem had imagined. On the upslope side, Ingrid had dug a shaft 18 inches in diameter and 4 feet deep, angling it so the opening sat under the cabin's eave line. On the downslope side, a similar shaft extended beyond the drip line, positioned so prevailing winds would create negative pressure and draw air through the system. Both shafts were lined with river rocks to prevent collapse and covered with wooden grills to keep out vermin. The trapdoor took her 3 days to build. She used pine boards scavenged from packing crates, planing them smooth and fitting them together with the precision her father had taught her. The batting came from an old quilt that had been moth-damaged beyond repair. The leather edge sealing came from strips cut from a worn-out saddle she'd bought for 50 cents at the trading post. When finished, the trapdoor weighed 37 pounds and sealed tight enough that it took effort to pull it open against the air pressure differential. Now came the real test. She needed firewood to fill the storage chamber, and Lars wasn't in condition to help with the splitting. Eric could manage kindling in small pieces, but the heavy work, turning rounds into split logs, required an adult's strength and an axe that didn't forgive mistakes. Ingrid had swung an axe before, helping her father in the Bergen boatyard, but never with the volume and urgency this task demanded. She needed 4 full cords by winter, which meant roughly 512 cubic feet of stacked wood. Each cord represented 128 cubic feet, which translated to roughly 600 to 800 individual pieces depending on how they were split. She had from mid-August until the first heavy snows, which could come as early as October in the Bitterroot. She set up her splitting area near a stand of dead lodgepole pine on the western edge of her property. Dead standing trees, known as snags in logging parlance, made ideal firewood. They'd already seasoned on the stump, losing most of their moisture content naturally. Lodgepole pine wasn't the best burning wood. It was a bit resinous and burned fast, but it was abundant, relatively straight-grained, and split easily when you hit it right. The work developed rhythm. Wake before dawn, feed chickens, make breakfast, start children on chores, walk to the woodlot with axe and canteen, set up a round on the chopping block, study the grain, raise the axe, bring it down. When it hit true, the round split with a satisfying crack. When it didn't, the axe stuck or glanced off, requiring another try. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her shoulders ached every evening, felt wooden every morning. But the stack grew. She split through August heat that reached 94 degrees, pausing hourly for water and shade. Eric hauled split pieces in a handcart, stacking them near the trapdoor opening. The fourth skeptic arrived in September. Reverend Samuel Hutchins served a circuit covering 4 settlements across 200 miles. He was educated at a Pennsylvania seminary, had served as Union chaplain during the war, and possessed both theological training and practical frontier experience. He also held strong opinions about proper gender roles. He found Ingrid splitting wood while Lars sat nearby. The Reverend's expression suggested he'd discovered something fundamentally disordered. "Mrs. Sorensen, I'm surprised to find you engaged in such labor. Surely there are men who could assist." "My husband broke his leg," Ingrid said, not stopping. and I'm capable of swinging an axe. I don't doubt your capability. Capability sounded like a character flaw. But there's a natural order. Men provide heavy labor. Women manage the household. When we upset that order, we invite disharmony. Ingrid set down her axe. Not because she agreed with him, but because she'd learned that arguing with clergy required your full attention. Reverend, with respect, the natural order in Montana Territory is that you do the work that needs doing, or you don't survive. My husband would split this wood if he could. He can't. I can. That seems like exactly the right order to me. And this underground storage chamber I've heard about? This too seems outside the natural order of things. News traveled fast in the valley, apparently. Ingrid wondered who'd told him. Probably Thomas Mackenzie, who still thought the whole project was foolish. It's a root cellar adapted for wood storage, Ingrid said. Nothing more unusual than that. I've seen root cellars, Mrs. Sorensen. They're typically built away from the living structure, not beneath it. You're undermining your foundation, literally and perhaps metaphorically. A house built on unstable ground cannot stand. Matthew chapter 7, verse 26. Lars, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. Reverend, with respect, we're not building on sand. We're creating storage space beneath a floor that's supported by stone pillars. The ground is stable clay. The design is sound. The design may be sound in engineering terms, the Reverend said. But what message does it send when a woman undertakes such projects? What does it teach your children about their proper roles? It teaches them that work is work, Ingrid said, picking up her axe again. And that survival requires using whatever abilities you have, regardless of who taught them to you or what gender you were born. Excuse me, Reverend, but I have another cord to split before supper. He left shortly after, and Ingrid knew she'd probably offended him. She also knew she didn't particularly care. The Reverend's natural order was a luxury purchased by people who had enough margin for error to enforce it. Out here, where the margin between survival and catastrophe could be measured in cords of firewood or pounds of dried beans, order meant doing what worked, not what looked proper to visitors from Pennsylvania. By late September, she'd split and hauled 4.5 cords of wood. The excess would go in a traditional external stack as backup, but the bulk of it went down through the trapdoor into the underground chamber. Eric had become skilled at stacking, creating rows that allowed air circulation between the pieces while maximizing the available space. The chamber held more than Ingrid had calculated. Its odd shape and various corners allowed for creative stacking patterns that used every cubic foot. The ventilation system worked exactly as planned. Air entering through the upslope shaft was noticeably cooler than the air in the chamber, creating a gentle but constant flow that carried moisture out through the downslope shaft. Ingrid had tested this by suspending a damp cloth in the chamber for 3 days. When she retrieved it, the cloth was completely dry, the moisture wicked away by the moving air. She'd also discovered an unexpected benefit of the underground storage. The constant 50-degree temperature meant the chamber stayed cool during late summer heat, making it a pleasant retreat when the cabin became stifling. Astrid had taken to reading down there in the afternoons, sitting on a split log with a book propped on her knees. Lars had joked that they'd built the territory's most expensive library, but Ingrid could see he was pleased with how the project had turned out. October brought the first serious test. A storm rolled in from the northwest on the 12th, dropping temperatures from 56 degrees to 22 degrees in 6 hours. Rain mixed with sleet hammered the valley for 2 days straight, then transitioned to wet, heavy snow that accumulated 14 inches before the storm moved on. The external woodpile, even with its roof overhang protection, became a frozen mass. The logs were coated in ice, and the snow between them had compressed into solid blocks that required a shovel to excavate. Ingrid opened the trapdoor and descended into the chamber. The firewood down there was exactly as she'd left it. Dry, loose, easy to handle. No ice, no snow, no moisture at all. The temperature in the chamber hovered around 52 degrees, warm enough that she could work without gloves, cool enough that the wood retained its seasoned dryness. She loaded her arms with split logs and climbed back up to the cabin. The next morning, Thomas Mackenzie came by to check on them. His own woodpile was ice-crusted, and he'd spent an hour that morning chipping logs free before he could get his morning fire started. When Ingrid showed him the underground chamber, he stood there for a long moment, lantern in hand, looking at the neat rows of dry firewood. "Well," he said finally, "I'll be damned." "Probably," Ingrid said, "but not because of the firewood storage." Thomas laughed, which surprised them both. "You know what this means, don't you? Every homesteader in the valley is going to want one of these come spring." "Then I hope they've got better clay than the Henderson place," Ingrid said. "Sandy soil would cave in before they got 3 feet down." The real vindication came in January. The winter of 1877 would be remembered as one of the coldest on record in Montana Territory, with temperatures dropping to 43 below zero on January 19th and staying below zero for 28 consecutive days. Most external woodpiles became unusable. The logs froze together in solid masses, and the moisture in the wood itself turned to ice, making the pieces nearly impossible to split if you needed smaller kindling. Families burned their wood wet, producing smoke that stained the snow black around their chimneys and created creosote buildup so severe that 3 chimney fires occurred in the valley between January and March. 2 families lost sections of their roofs. 1 lost their entire cabin. The Sorensen family burned dry wood all winter. Every morning Ingrid descended through the trapdoor and selected that day's fuel from the neat rows in the underground chamber. The wood split cleanly when she needed kindling. It caught easily from the starter. It burned hot and clean, producing minimal smoke and maximum heat. On the coldest nights, when wind chill pushed the effective temperature down near 50 below, their cabin stayed warm enough that frost didn't form on the inside walls. Willem de Groot stopped by in February, ostensibly to discuss a timber contract with Lars, but really to see the underground storage for himself. He descended into the chamber with his own lantern, examining the ventilation shafts, the clay walls, the stacked firewood, and the trapdoor's sealing mechanism. "How much did this cost you?" he asked when he climbed back up. "In materials. Maybe $7 for the trapdoor hardware and the lantern fuel I used while digging. The rest was labor and time." "And you did it yourself?" "Eric helped with the hauling. Lars consulted on the engineering. But yes, I did the digging and construction." Willem nodded slowly. "I've built 17 structures in Montana Territory. Houses, barns, mills, storage sheds. This is the cleverest bit of practical engineering I've seen in any of them. You know what the real genius is? You didn't try to fight the environment. You used it. The ground's constant temperature, the natural slope for drainage, the prevailing winds for ventilation. You worked with what you had instead of against it." He placed an order for a timber cutting the next week and paid a 15% premium over his usual rate, his way of acknowledging value where he found it. Margaret Chen visited in March, bringing fresh bread and news from her section of the valley. The O'Briens had made it through the winter, though they'd burned green wood for 6 weeks, and Patrick had developed a cough that worried Margaret considerably. They'd lost 2 chickens to a weasel and a milk cow to bloat, but overall, they'd survived. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said, sitting at the kitchen table while Astrid poured coffee. "I thought this storage chamber was an unnecessary risk, but after this winter, I'm thinking Patrick and I should build one ourselves come spring." "What changed your mind?" Ingrid asked. "Watching him cough every morning from the smoke. Watching our chimney turn black from creosote. Realizing that dry firewood isn't a luxury. It's a survival necessity in this climate." She paused. "Also, I heard what Reverend Hutchins said about natural order in women's work. That probably made me more inclined to support your project out of pure stubbornness." They'd both laughed at that, the shared understanding of women who'd learned to navigate men's opinions while pursuing their own solutions. Even Reverend Hutchins came around, though it took until April. He arrived without warning, as was his custom, and found Ingrid working in the garden while Lars supervised the children's mathematics lessons inside. The Reverend's opening gambit surprised her. "Mrs. Sorensen, I've been hearing reports about your underground storage chamber all winter. Hearing about families that struggled with frozen wood while your family stayed warm and safe. I wanted to apologize for my earlier comments about natural order and proper roles." Ingrid set down her hoe and gave him her full attention. "That's unexpected, Reverend. I've been thinking about the parable of the talents," he said, "about the servant who buried his talent in the ground versus the servants who invested theirs and multiplied their value. You were given abilities, engineering knowledge from your father, physical strength, practical wisdom. You invested those abilities in your family's survival. Who am I to say that was outside God's natural order? I appreciate that, Reverend. Although, he added with a slight smile, I notice you haven't started a business building underground storage chambers for other families. The valley would benefit from your expertise. Maybe next year, Ingrid said. This year, I'm focused on improving our irrigation system and expanding the garden. One engineering project per season seems like enough. The legacy of Ingrid's innovation spread beyond the Bitterroot Valley. Willem de Groot mentioned it to contractors in Missoula, who mentioned it to homesteaders in the Flathead Valley, who adapted the concept to their own situations. By 1880, at least 30 families across western Montana had built some version of underground wood storage, each one customized to local soil conditions, available space, and family needs. The concept made particular sense in the northern plains and mountain territories where winters were severe but ground conditions favored excavation. It never caught on in areas with high water tables or unstable soil, but wherever you had clay or stable earth, constant ground temperature, and a need to keep bulk materials dry, the underground chamber offered advantages over traditional storage. Modern archaeologists working in Montana have documented at least 15 homestead sites with evidence of excavated storage chambers beneath cabin floors. Most date to the late 1870s and early 1880s. They're typically identified by the support pillar configurations, the ventilation shaft scars, and the characteristic floor joists pattern that allowed for trapdoor access. Some chambers show evidence of use extending into the 1890s, suggesting the design proved durable over time. There's a broader principle at work here, one that extends beyond firewood storage or frontier engineering. Ingrid Sorensen succeeded not because she had some exceptional talent that others lacked, but because she paid attention to the specific conditions of her situation and refused to accept generic solutions that didn't fit. She observed that ground temperature stayed constant. She noticed that her cabin's design created unused space beneath the floor. She understood moisture dynamics from her father's shipbuilding experience. She combined these observations into a solution that addressed her particular needs. That's the essence of practical innovation, not inventing something entirely new, but recognizing how existing principles can be recombined to solve immediate problems. The physics of convection and air circulation were well understood in 1876. Underground storage was ancient technology. What Ingrid did was apply these established concepts to a specific situation in a way that others hadn't considered. It's worth noting that she faced skepticism from people with legitimate expertise. Thomas Mackenzie had 8 years of frontier experience. Willem de Groot had built half the structures in his region. Reverend Hutchins had theological training and practical wisdom from a military career. None of them were fools, and none of them opposed the project out of malice. They doubted because they'd seen enough frontier innovations fail to be cautious about new approaches. Ingrid succeeded not by dismissing their concerns, but by addressing them through careful design and methodical execution. She reinforced the pillars to prevent structural damage. She created proper drainage to prevent flooding. She engineered ventilation to prevent moisture accumulation. She proved her concept through results rather than arguments. That pattern, observation, adaptation, methodical execution, empirical validation, shows up repeatedly in successful frontier innovations. The sod house builders who learned to stack bricks on edge for better insulation. The dry farmers who developed techniques for moisture retention in arid climates. The miners who adapted stamp mill designs to local ore characteristics. They succeeded not through revolutionary insights, but through careful attention to local conditions and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when circumstances demanded it. The Sorensen family proved up their homestead claim in 1881 and received title to their 160 acres. Lars fully recovered from his leg injury and worked as a timber contractor for Willem de Groot until 1889. Eric became a civil engineer, studying at the Montana School of Mines, and eventually working on railroad construction across the Northern Territories. Astrid married a teacher named James Morrison and operated a school in Stevensville for 34 years. Ingrid lived until 1923, long enough to see Montana achieve statehood, long enough to see automobiles replace horse-drawn wagons, long enough to watch electric lights come to Stevensville. She gave several interviews to local historians in the 1910s, and in one of them she was asked about the underground storage chamber that had made her locally famous. "It wasn't anything special," she said. "It was just paying attention to what the land was telling me, and having the stubbornness to dig a big hole when everyone thought I was crazy. The frontier taught me that the difference between survival and failure often comes down to whether you're willing to work with what you have rather than waiting for ideal conditions that might never arrive." That lesson remains relevant long after the frontier closed, long after the last homestead claim was filed, long after the kerosene lamps gave way to electric lights. We still face situations where conventional solutions don't quite fit our circumstances. We still encounter skepticism from people with legitimate expertise. We still have to decide whether to wait for ideal conditions or work with what we have. Ingrid Sorensen chose to work with what she had: clay soil, an elevated cabin, a broken-legged husband, and practical knowledge inherited from a father who built ships in Bergen. She combined these elements into a solution that kept her family warm through Montana winters, and demonstrated that the most effective innovations often come from paying close attention to local conditions rather than importing generic solutions. The underground chamber she built is long gone, collapsed or filled in sometime after the original cabin was replaced with a more modern structure. But the principle behind it, that observation, adaptation, and careful execution can solve problems that seem insurmountable, that remain solid as the fieldstone pillars she reinforced, and just as capable of supporting weight when properly applied. So, if you found value in this story about frontier innovation and practical wisdom, subscribe to this channel to help preserve these accounts of traditional knowledge and the people who developed it. These stories matter because they document not just what people built, but how they thought about problems and created solutions. And if you appreciate the research that goes into recovering these pieces of frontier history, give this video a like so others can discover these stories of creativity and stubbornness that helped settle a continent. The specifics of underground firewood storage might seem like historical curiosity now, but the underlying patterns of innovation and adaptation remain as useful today as they were in Montana Territory in 1876.